Okay? Now, my question is this. How did that come to be? How did that bundle of possibilities that emerged from your mother's womb, however many decades ago, wind up looking like you? That raises for me the issue of character. When we describe ourselves, whether we describe other people or even groups of people, when we do that in moral terms, what we're really taking up is the issue of character. Character refers to the moral identity of a person, an identity that really is rooted in the very depths of our sense of ourselves. Character is not our personalities. It's deeper than that. When we talk about personalities, personalities are neither good nor evil. They're just appealing or unappealing. But we don't make moral judgments about people's personalities. Character is something, or the way in which we define who we are, not so much outwardly, as I'll try to explain, but at the core of my inner self. And I'm going to suggest to you that our character is an identity which is unique, and also importantly for our discussion of freedom, our character is in a very real sense self-chosen. Our character is a moral reality that's rooted in our habits of thinking, our ways of feeling, the motivations we have, the dispositions we have. You might say character is the constellation of the moral qualities that influence how does a person decide and make decisions? How is a person moved to act? And it's character that can be described as good or bad. Now, the other thing to understand is character is not just who we pretend to be, or even, it's not even who we aspire to be. Character is really about who we are. Who really are we becoming over the course of our lives? We might think about character as a sort of moral fingerprint for each of us, because we each have a unique character. Unique not only because of the choices I have made in my life, but also about how I have responded to events that happened to me in my life. But character is not like our genetic structure. It's not something that's simply given to us at our conception. Character is self-chosen. It is the shape that our lives take over the course of the conversation that goes on between myself and the world in which I live. In all the events, in all the choices of our lives, we gradually form a center, a self at the center of our lives. We begin to pull ourselves together and create a self. Over time, we become a person who acts consistently and with purpose. So we use the word character to integrate the various dimensions of my life into a consistent and coherent me. If you'd put that first slide up, Dave, you'll see here a little outline of what we've just been talking about. Okay. That character is this deep sense of self that each of us has when we are thinking about who we are. Again, our moral fingerprint. Now, to understand how this is possible, what's really important now is that we understand how moral theologians think about the whole issue of, one might say, the question of freedom. And Dave, if you'd go now to slide 2. The first thing I want to say about freedom is that there are degrees of freedom. You and I are free, but we're never simply free. We all have limitations due to heredity. We have limitations due to our genetic structure. We have limitations due to the society and the culture in which we are born. You and I are very different people because we live in the United States in the 21st century than if we were living in some other part of the globe in an earlier century. So our freedom is never exercised in a vacuum. It's always exercised within a context, and it's also always exercised with the limitations that come from personal qualities such as our genetic structure, the intelligence we're endowed with, our physical strength, our psychological makeup, the relationships we have with family. All these things can influence our sense of self. And so freedom is exercised, but it's always exercised within limits. But I want to say to you that even within those limits, you and I still exercise freedom. To use an analogy, we're all playing with a deck of cards, and there's only so many cards on the deck, and we get dealt a certain hand. But once we're dealt that hand, we do have the freedom to play the cards the way we choose to. So in a very real sense, you and I have been dealt a hand. We've been dealt a moral hand as we begin our life and as we live our lives. But that doesn't deny the fact that within those limits that we've been dealt with, we still exercise freedom. That's the first distinction to make, that we are free, but our freedom is a matter of degree. We're never simply free, but we are free within limits. That's going to have a big influence when we come around to talking about sin and conversion. But the second thing I want to stress, and this really is the important distinction for tonight. If you get this distinction we're going to talk about now for a few moments, everything else that I say tonight and the next couple of weeks will hang together for you. And that is, we must distinguish between two kinds of freedom. Freedom of choice and what I'm going to call basic freedom. These two notions of freedom are distinct from each other, but they are related to each other. You can distinguish between freedom of choice and basic freedom, but you cannot treat them or think about them as completely indifferent or unrelated to one another. Another way of talking about this is, as I'll mention in a second, freedom of choice is when we think about ourselves as agents, as doers of deeds. Basic freedom is when we think about ourselves as persons, as people who are more than and are larger than simply the actions that we do. So freedom, two kinds, basic and freedom of choice. They are distinct, but they are related. Dave, let's go to slide 3. Distinct. Think about it this way. Freedom of choice entails many choices, but basic freedom entails one choice. It's the choice of the self. But they are related. My basic freedom is never chosen directly, but freedom of choice is always mediated through our basic freedom. I'm going to spend a little time talking about that in a second. But again, this is seeing ourselves, you might say it's two different perspectives on what it means to be human. On the one hand, we are humans, exercise agency. We make choices. We select things. We opt for one thing over another. We make all kinds of choices. We do all kinds of deeds. But then also, we are persons who are a larger and broader and deeper understanding of ourselves than simply doers of deeds, because the person both precedes and transcends our deeds. So think of it this way. You and I go into the supermarket, and this is the way Americans tend to think about freedom, freedom of choice. The more choices, the more free you are. So we go down the cereal aisle, and we've got 30 different varieties of cereal to choose from. This is a free country. We have so many choices about cereal or dog food or any other number of choices that you get in a supermarket. Freedom. But there is another kind of freedom, and that is the freedom of the person. In all the choices we are making, we are also, in a very real sense, choosing ourselves. The various choices we make eventually redound upon my sense of myself and who I am. So in that sense, the freedom of the person precedes any choice I make, and it's greater than any choice that I make. Ultimately, the freedom of the person is I am becoming someone who is open to and relates to God and others as someone who wants to be in relationship and in covenant with God and with other people. I am faithful to the covenant of love that God offers me. Or, over time, I may become a person who rejects that offer. I become a person who chooses something other than God as my primary relationship. I choose something other than other people to love. And so the major choice, of course, or the major alternative to loving others and loving God is to fall in love with myself. That ultimately, over the course of my life, I become someone who thinks first and primary of myself rather than God and others. So the gospel invitation to give ourselves away as precisely the way to find yourself, we choose another path. We choose to seek ourselves through looking out for myself, taking care of number one, being the person who's more concerned about myself than others and God. Just as a little digression here, if that makes some sense to you, if that ultimately is the big choice we have, will we be someone who lives faithfully in covenant with God or others, or will we be somebody who is wrapped up in oneself? That suggests that it's possible as a little thought experiment, that heaven and hell are really the same place. Heaven is the experience of everlasting life with God and other people whom I love. And so heaven is the experience of endless community of love. I get to spend eternity with the very ones whom I love. Alternatively, hell is I get to spend eternity with people I don't love. I get to spend eternity with a God I never learned to know. I get to spend eternity with people I've never cared about, really, rather than myself. So that heaven is the experience of ongoing, eternal community of love. And hell is getting to spend eternity with a group of strangers to me. And so it's not so much that God sends us to hell or rewards us with heaven. God simply confirms for us in our lives what we have made of ourselves. We have made of ourselves someone who chooses love and communion, or we've made of ourselves someone who chooses isolation and self-preoccupation. And what God does is lets us experience that for all eternity. Heaven and hell may just be the same place and the same experience, but we will experience it very differently, depending upon whether we have learned to love or not. That's not central to my point tonight, but it's just a little digression about what possible, you might say, benefit or side insight one could derive from this, about thinking about what does heaven and hell really entail. And rather than thinking, oh, heaven and hell is all God's doing, heaven and hell is what God does to us, and getting into discussions about, can a compassionate God really send people to hell? It may be that God doesn't send anyone to hell. All God does is give us eternal life. And what we have is, we have life with strangers, or we have life in love. Dave, if you could show the next slide. Morally speaking, how do you become a virtuous person? How do you become a lover? How do you become a compassionate person? Aristotle put the question of, his question was, how does one become a just person? And his answer is, I'm using a neologism here, Aristotle's basic answer is, you become just by doing justice. A just person justices, we might say. That the way you become just is by practicing justice. Because what Aristotle grasped, you see, was this idea of basic freedom. That in all the day-to-day choices I am making about whether or not I will be just, how will I relate to other people in just and fair ways or in other ways, I am making of myself someone who is just. I turn myself into a certain kind of character by the choices I'm making. Remember my point about that basic freedom is never chosen directly, all right? It's worked out through daily living. So one could look at this negatively, to put it in a negative way. How is it that some people at the end of their lives wind up being sons of bitches? How is it that there are some people who wind up being unhappy, grouchy, miserable, miserly, unkind, unjust? When I first joined the friars, part of my experience was just meeting so many other friars. And for the most part, it's been an absolutely wonderful experience. I can't imagine my life being anything better than the life I've experienced by becoming a Franciscan and living in community with my brothers in the order. But I will admit, and this won't come as any shock to you, amidst the hundreds of friars that I know, I have come across a couple of guys who are really pretty miserable human beings. And one of my questions was, especially when I was younger, was, why are they here? Why are they friars? Why would someone who is so indifferent to other people, or someone who is so selfish, or someone who is so impatient and unkind in the way they relate to other people, why would such a person join the Franciscans? And then I talked with their classmates. I came to know guys who were friends of those guys when they were my age as a young man. And what you found again and again was they weren't that way when they joined the Franciscans. They came with the same ideals. They came with the same desires and hopes that everybody else came with. But over the course of time, they began to make choices. Maybe the choice was, I'm not going to do any more work and what I have to do. Maybe the choice was, let somebody else run that errand rather than me. I'm tired of always being the one who goes to answer the door or to pick up the phone in the parish. Gradually, one becomes someone who says, when I'm sitting in front of the TV, I want to control the remote. I want to watch what I want to watch. Or when I go to have dinner, I want to be first in line, so I get the choice about the cut of meat that I want. Gradually, over the course of time, individuals, not through any terrible thing, I've never met a friar who was an axe murderer. I've never met a friar who defrauded widows and orphans of their life savings. But over the course of time, they just kept making everyday decisions that put themselves first and everybody else later. Over the course of time, they simply made choices that were about self-gratification rather than self-giving and self-donation. They never woke up in the morning and said, I think I'm going to become an SOB. But what they did do was they, in the course of their lives, lived in such a way that the sum total of all their actions and decisions and choices gradually shaped them so that over time they became an SOB. So how do you become a Christian disciple? And the answer, of course, is through day-to-day living. You become a Christian disciple the same way you become an SOB, except you make decisions that aren't about self-gratification, that aren't about looking out for myself or just taking care of my own or meeting my needs, but one lives one's life and we try as best we can to give ourselves away to others. We try as best we can to think of others first rather than oneself. We try as best we can to be honest, even if that's going to cost me something. We try as best we can to be hardworking, even when I'm tired. But over the course of our lives, we make all kinds of choices. And over the course of our lives, you see, we are gradually exercising our basic freedom. We are becoming self-determining. We are creating a self, not through any one gesture or one decision, but myself is being shaped through all the day-to-day decisions of freedom of choice that I make. That's why I say you can distinguish freedom of choice from basic freedom, but they are related because I never exercise freedom, basic freedom directly. It's always mediated through my daily, day-to-day acts of free choice. So let me give another very practical example and simple one. I am not a musician. I have really very few musical talents. Anyone who's heard me sing over the microphone knows that by now. I can't carry a tune in a bucket, and I have no ability to play an instrument. But I can tell you, if I had one dream, it might be I would love to be a jazz pianist. My idea of a great time would be to walk into a supper club, sit down at a piano, start playing, and give people a great time and set a mood in a room by playing the piano. So I want to become a piano player. How does that happen? I don't sit here and just say to myself, I want to be a piano player. I want to be a piano player. I don't just keep saying it intensely and make a fist and say, I'm going to be a piano player. It never happens. What I do have to do is say, maybe I should go find some mentor who can teach me how to play a piano. Maybe I should buy a keyboard and begin to learn finger exercises and the placement of my fingers on a keyboard. Maybe I should study music and learn how to read notes and keys and the like. Maybe I should practice every day for at least a little while. Maybe I should learn how other people have learned the piano and copy some of their techniques or methods. In other words, if I do those things, if I study music, if I get someone to teach me certain things about the piano, if I practice faithfully every day, maybe a year from now, 2 years from now, 3 years from now, if you say to me, Himes, are you a piano player? I might be able to say to you, yeah, I am. But I didn't get there just by willing myself into being a musician. I got there by all kinds of day-to-day decisions about, I'll carve out time in my day to practice. I'll take lessons. I'll study music. I'll observe how other people play. Gradually over time, I transform myself from a non-musician into a musician. Well, in a very real sense, that same thing happens morally, you see. How do I become a Christian disciple? How do I grow as a follower of the Lord? Not by standing in front of a baptismal vow or a baptismal font and saying, make me a Christian, make me a Christian. I want to be a Christian. That doesn't do it. But if every day I get up and I try and embody the gospel, I try and treat people a certain way, I try and use my gifts in a certain style, I try to live in such a way that over the course of time, eventually, some people might look at me and say, there's a good man. There's a believing Christian. There's someone who takes the gospel seriously. Basic freedom is more than any one set of choices. Yet basic freedom only gets worked out through day-to-day choices. The two freedoms do not conflict with one another. They are distinct, but they are related, although not identical. Dave, can we go to the next slide? The heart of the process of self-determination is the creation of the character of a person. We use our basic freedom to make something of ourselves, whether we are consciously aware of it or not. And most of the time, we're not aware of it. But throughout our daily living, you and I are creating a person who is either oriented to God, living in covenant, or directed towards some lesser goal or purpose, usually oneself. This is the point, my point about heaven and hell, you see. No one, if you go up to them and say, do you want to be in hell? Well, who's going to say yes? Doesn't everybody want to go to heaven? Of course, right? But just saying, I want to go to heaven, I want to go to heaven, doesn't get you to heaven. And just because you don't choose consciously hell, it doesn't mean you're not fashioning yourself as a citizen of it. It all depends upon our daily choices. It all depends on the way we choose to live on a day in, day out basis. No one thing we do makes us a Christian, makes us a saint. No one thing we do makes us a demon or an evil person. But over the course of our lives, we create a self who is open to others, or we create a self that's enclosed upon myself. Now, too often, especially in the past, Catholics got all caught up in the way most of us were taught the sacrament of penance and these other sacraments. We got all caught up in specific acts of freedom of choice. So we went into a confessional and, Forgive me, Father, I lied 4 times, I cursed 3 times, I disobeyed my parents 6 times, I did this, I missed Mass, I didn't say my prayers. We rattled off a laundry list of things we either did or didn't do. But we didn't walk in, at least not very often, walk into a confrontation with or an encounter with a confessor and say, I really worry that I'm becoming an angry person. I really worry that I'm becoming selfish. I worry that in the end, deep down, I'm a racist. I worry that I'm lazy. I worry that I don't really feel any deep compassion for poor people or for suffering people. We didn't really think about the character that we were shaping for ourselves. We got preoccupied with the deeds we did. The deeds are not unimportant, but we focused on the level of freedom of choice, and we didn't sufficiently address and reflect upon and get guidance for what kind of person am I becoming? What kind of person do I want to be? That's really the heart of the moral life I'd like to suggest to you. The real task of the moral life is becoming the proper sort of person, to grow as someone who is manifestly a woman or a man who loves, who is selfless, who is self-giving, who opens themselves to others, who has a particular concern for the vulnerable, the weak, those in need, rather than someone who's always worried about, am I getting my share? Am I getting all the credit that I think I deserve? Am I getting the rewards that I want? Am I secure? Am I doing okay? That's really the ongoing challenge of the moral life. Dave, can we go to the last slide? That's probably the words you were waiting to hear from me, the last slide. All right. 3 points to take away tonight that I'm going to end with before we go into discussion. The first thing to recognize is, and we'll take up all of these points more next week when we move into sin, but to highlight them now for a second, or at least flag them for us. Our basic freedom is not always engaged in the same way by every active choice. My going into Price Chopper and buying cornflakes or Cheerios is really not a life-changing decision. My choice about, do I have a BLT or a salad, is really not going to probably reorientate my life. Right? Not everything that we do can touch and shape our self. Not every choice of free choice really can mediate the basic freedom to us. But if for no other reason other than it involves more money, and that involves other judgments I'm going to make, the choice of what car I drive, that's a more serious choice reflecting some of my values than Cheerios or cornflakes. The career path I choose to follow, that can be very formative in my life. Most of us spend a good deal of our waking lives at work. The work I choose to do, the place where I choose to work, the co-workers I'm going to have with me in my work, those kinds of choices can be deeply formative of who I am and may really shape me in significant ways. Who I will marry. Will I marry? Will I have children? How will I deal with my aging parents? How will I deal with my close friends? Will I maintain certain friendships over the course of time? Will I separate from people? Those kinds of choices can really become deeply shaping and determinative of who I am. So not everything we do really touches our character in the same way. There are some choices that are fairly superficial. They just can't carry the freight of my identity. There are other choices that become profoundly significant for the sort of person I will become over the course of my days. So that's important to remember because it shows you the danger of too quickly making judgments about people based on some choices that they make. Because some choices that they do may not really be revelatory of who they are. An example, I spend my better part of my working life as a lawyer who deals in international trade, and I spend most of my career trying to forge unfair trade agreements so that my company can take advantage of poor nations and their natural resources. But at Christmas, I watched It's a Wonderful Life with Jimmy Stewart and Donna Reed, and I got a little sentimental. So I wrote a check for $50 for the food pantry at St. Vincent's. That gift of the St. Vincent's is a wonderful thing to do. It's a nice thing to do. Is that truly indicative of who I am? Or is what I do the other 364 days of the year as a trade lawyer more indicative of who I am? It works the other way too, of course, right? It may be that I'm basically a good person. You know me to be such. And yet, one day you see me and I lose it. I am yelling. I am irate. I'm impatient. I'm angry. And you look at me and you sort of say, well, that's a side of him I never saw before. And an hour or two later, I come to you and I say, hey, I'm really sorry. I'm just not myself today. Now, you could take me literally and say, well, if you're not yourself, who the hell are you, right? But if you understand what I'm saying, you're saying, I'm just in a bad place today. I've got a lot of things on my mind, or I just heard some terrible news. I've got some real worries about someone in my family or my own health or whatever it may be. You caught me at a bad time. I'm so sorry I was rude. I'm so sorry I brushed you off. I'm so sorry I raised my voice. And you know me well enough that you sort of take me at my word and say, okay, we all have had our bad days. We've all had our bad moments. That bad day or those bad moments are not truly reflective of my character. You know me to be better than that. Right? So this can cut both ways. Sometimes the good we do is not really reflective of our character, which is quite flawed. But sometimes the wrong things I do are not really reflective of my good character. So there's the danger of making judgments about people that we don't know too well, and we rush to judgment based upon a small series of incidents or actions, and not really seeing this person over the long haul, and that might say the arc of their life. The second point, that basic freedom is not locked in, it can evolve. I can be a certain kind of person, but I can change. I may have some devastating experience that makes me deeply embittered, that turns me into someone who becomes profoundly cynical, that learns not to trust other people, I've been hurt once. Hurt me once, your fault. Hurt me twice, my fault. I never should have let you get that close to me. Right? You can become a certain person in reaction to certain events in one's life that really change people, right? That really affect them in very negative ways, and their character begins to change, sometimes for the better, sometimes for the worse. But the point is, our basic freedom is not determined once and for all, and then it's locked in. This is not like our DNA. We're not just simply given our basic freedom. We're always creating and fashioning it. You may have met somebody, or you may have been good friends with someone when you were younger. And then you haven't seen that person. They move away, or you move away, you lose touch. You don't see someone for 7, 10 years. And then you run into them again. And you engage in a conversation, and you're talking with them, and you're spending time with them. And at the end of it, you walk away and you say to yourself, boy, she's changed. She's not the person she used to be. And that can be for the better or for the worse, right? You can look back and say, boy, she's become such a lovely, gracious person. She has such a nice way about her in the way she encounters other people. Or you might say to yourself, boy, that person has really gotten sour. Boy, that person has become very distrustful. You can go either direction, but the point is our basic freedom does evolve over time. We usually don't change from Monday to Tuesday, but over the course of months and years, human beings can become really different sorts of people. And so we're always evolving, and throughout our lives, there's always the risk that we begin to deteriorate in character. And there's always the hope that we deepen and grow in character. It's why perseverance is a virtue. It's not all locked in at some point. You have to keep struggling in daily life. You have to keep trying. You can't give up on yourself, and you can't give up on others. Nor can you be so presumptuous as to think, who I am, I'm good enough, no need to change. That leads to my third point and final point for tonight. Basic freedom is a process. It is something that occurs over time. And so therefore, how we live our daily lives really does matter. There may be moments in life when we make some really big decisions, some important choices, values in our lives, and those lives become significantly impactful upon who we are. But even those moments are not the entire sum and substance of who we are. It is an ongoing process. There are moments of great significance, there are moments of lesser significance, and Cheerios or cornflakes may be moments of no significance. But it's always a daily, ongoing process until the day we die. We are always shaping and forming who we are becoming. And even when we're on the right path and we continue on that path, we can grow deeply. I may be profoundly in love with my spouse, but something happens in our marriage and I fall even more deeply in love with my spouse. The person I married, I love them even more 20 years out or 40 years out than I did when we first married. And sadly, as we know, I might be madly in love with someone in the first 20 years, and the marriage dissolves. We can intensify our love. We can deteriorate in love. It's a process. We can't ever act so presumptuously as to think, what I've done enough. It's never enough until we encounter the Lord face to face. Our time here and what we do with our daily lives, that is what shapes our character. That is what shapes who we are as persons and what we make of ourselves over the course of our lives. That's the deeper meaning of freedom. Not just freedom of choice, but freedom to determine a self. And that's the language of character in the moral life. And the next 2 weeks, we're going to talk about the darker moments of character formation with sin and the brighter moments of character formation with conversion. Why don't I stop there, Dave?
Okay.
So I've given Dave some questions that I suggest that we move into smaller groups, and Dave will provide those questions for you.
They're in the chat right now. They're in the chat.
Right now. And you can just have a little time. One of the questions may engage you more than another one. That's fine. Discuss the questions you want to talk about or share. And then after some time in discussion, Dave will call us back into the larger group, and we'll have a chance for some final questions and answers and feedback before we end the evening. Dave, I turn it over to you.
You're in process. Thank you. 4 in each group, and it'll be going in a minute. We'll be in for 20 minutes. And the rooms are opened. One. Okay, I think we are pretty much all back. What I would ask, if you have a suggestion, since we still have a pretty large group here, is on your screen, on the right side and the bottom, there's the More button. And under the More button, there is a Reactions. And within Reactions, there's a Raise Hand. I think that's at least my version of Zoom. There may be different versions of Zoom out there. But I'm suggesting that people raise their hand, and I'll be happy to call on, because we have a good number of people here. So I will just and have people talk if any feedback they had about what they had.
David, can you explain that one more time?
Sure. Sorry about that.
Okay. Hand with the raised
What
hand,
it is on your bottom, there's a series of icons on the bottom of your screen. At least on my screen, the reaction button is under the More one. And maybe you may have a different version of Zoom. I don't know. And if it isn't there, find the Reactions button and click on the raise hand screen, so I will know you're interested in saying something.
Okay, thank you. I see it now. Thank you for that.
Not a problem. Okay, let's see. Let's go. A second, I'll find that. Excuse me, sir. Here it is. Okay. Okay. Nicholas Miser, please unmute and speak.
Father Himes, thank you. I just wanted to say I really appreciated this and enjoyed it a lot. And this basic distinction that you're between the basic free will and the agentive one is really interesting. And I just wonder if you could point us towards, is this are you drawing this, what tradition is this coming out of, or who writes about this? Where can we read more background on this?
Yeah, it's in many ways, Nicholas, this way of thinking emerged in the years after the council. And there was a Belgian theologian named Louis Monden, M-O-N-D-E-N, who first started talking about this way of thinking. The language he used was, his French term was l'option fondamentale. And in English, there have been a number of writers who just use that term translated, fundamental option. And that's what he called basic freedom. And it was this idea that in the end of life, with all the multiplicity of choices and decisions we're all called upon to make, then ultimately there's one fundamental decision, and that is, what kind of person am I going to be? And it's out of that. And over the years, numbers of other people have picked up on it. Some use different language. Karl Rahner, who was a very significant German Jesuit theologian at Vatican II and in the post-Vatican II years, he used to talk about transcendental freedom. That's what he meant by basic freedom, the freedom that transcends any particular one choice, and what he called categorical freedom, which is what we call freedom of choice, that you choose between categories, kinds of cereal, what car you're going to drive, the clothes you're going to wear, a blue shirt or red shirt. That was categorical freedom for him. There are others who've used other terms. I just use freedom of choice and basic freedom because it seems to me in good old American English, they're pretty easily understood. And so I've tended to use those. But this language, or the ideas that the language is trying to capture and denote, it's been around really now for about 50 years or so. There have been theologians, initially mainly in Western Europe. It gradually, after the council, began to be, talked about here in the States. And when I started teaching in 1980, I started teaching courses and was using this language even then in the 1980s. So it's been around for a good while. And I think it's fair to say it's pretty much standard Catholic moral theology these days. People may quibble about, the best term to use, or how exactly would you define this versus that. But the general gist of what I gave you is pretty much, I think, a fair summation of what many, many, many moral theologians would say today in trying to think about this idea of the human person as being a free being.
Bob, you have a thought?
Yeah, I do. First of all, I thought the talk was great, and my background's psychology, so this really resonates. In fact, I'm teaching tomorrow night on self-determination theory, so it's like very consistent with things that I'm going to be talking about tomorrow night. But I did feel I told my partners in crime that, as you were talking, Father Himes, that there was something missing for me in the conversation. And I was puzzling about what it was. And it occurred to me that, in my experience, major events that have formed my character don't seem to be the result of a collection of my choices. They seem to be actually the result of God's presence in my life. Mm-hmm. And you may be talking about this, about conversion, maybe in a subsequent part of our series, but I have felt that moments of my life, usually moments of crisis or significant change, that God has presented God's self to me in ways that have changed or informed my choices in powerful ways.
Yeah.
And I can't deny God as an agent in my character formation. I know that my choices have made a difference in my character formation, but boy, oh boy, I have seen, felt, and witnessed God actively participating in that as well. And I have to acknowledge that too.
So that's an excellent point, Bob. And I don't want to, this is what oftentimes Protestants will accuse Catholics of being, which is that we ascribe too much power to the human condition and not enough to God's grace, and how God's transforming us. It's not all a human project. And I don't mean to suggest it's all God doing,
No.
But your point's well taken. What I would say is God's action, though, invites a reaction. To me, the great example of this, when I think about how freedom happens even in very what we would think of as circumscribed situations is, I think of the life of Nelson Mandela, arrested, put off on that prison island for years, doing hard physical labor, isolated from his wife and family, isolated from the political party that he was the leader of, really sort of exiled from South African society. And when this all happened, of course, there was a fair amount of anger in Mandela. There was a tolerance of violence in some situations. There was a certain amount of doubt about the possibilities of creating a just society in apartheid South Africa. And yet, the man who got on a boat from Robben Island, where he had been in that prison, and came back to South Africa, in the accounts that I read, even the prison guards at Robben Island would say the man who came out of that prison was a far better man than the man who went into the prison. That here is a guy who had gone through tremendous limitations on his freedom of action, on the choices presented with him. He had become simply a prisoner whose day in and day out actions were deeply controlled and circumscribed by a racist and unjust state. And yet people say that he became a deeper man, a better man, a richer man. And what it was, it seems to me, is it was not that he could control so many of the external circumstances of his life. He couldn't. But what he could control was how he was going to respond to the lack of freedom. And it was precisely in the way he acted in response to this harsh treatment that made him a better and richer person. And so I want to say that on a positive sense, God acts in our lives. God opens doors in our lives. God invites us into situations that we didn't foresee, and we kind of almost happily fell into them. But there still is the question about how are we going to respond to the open door? Will we walk in? Are we going to approach it in faith? Are we going to go into it muttering and cursing and, groaning about it? That always, God's grace is always freely given. It has to be freely received. We are capable of rejecting and refusing God's invitation. And so I think you're exactly right. The moments of God's grace can be deeply transformative, but they don't do it against our will. God's working with our will and inviting us into cooperation and inviting us into a response. So Jesus's preaching was obviously a deep and profound grace breaking into the life of Palestine in the first century. And there were people who heard that preaching, and some could accept it and make it a part of their lives, interiorize it, and grow as disciples. And there were others who said, nice words, but I got other things on my mind. I've got to feed the kids. I got to make my payment of that, that seed that I borrowed. I got to get ahead in life. I'm just too tired. I've had a tough week. I can't be listening to this guy preaching about the kingdom of God. There's all different responses that Jesus encounters. The grace is being offered to everybody, right? I firmly believe God's grace is always and everywhere present. But there's always the question of our response to that grace. And so your point is very well taken, and I agree with it completely, that God's activity in our lives is the bedrock oftentimes that empowers our ability to be transformed. But there always of a human response to God's offer. God doesn't save us against our will. God is inviting us to exercise our will in cooperation with his vision of what human life can be. So it's not an either or. And if I presented it in that way, I didn't mean to. It's very much, and this is the Catholic approach to life. Many people have said Catholics don't do either or. We always do both and, right? We always want both sides of the question. We don't like saying it's either this or that. We always say, well, there's something there, but there's also something over here. Both and language is profoundly Catholic language.
Michael, you can have the last question or comment. Mike?
I just took myself off mute. I just wanted to follow up on what you said, Father, again, and thank you for that. I think, it's possible always to accept the grace. As you said, I will say now that I'm retired, it's a lot easier to do it at this point because there were so many things that are always competing for your time and attention, and you have bosses in your life, in your younger life, and you are hopefully learning and being wiser and not as impulsive and all of that stuff that goes on when you're younger. So I don't know if you have any thoughts on that, but I know that I see many faces here who are all servants at this point in our older age in the food pantry and in other places. And I said in our group, I just feel at this age, one of the blessings is that I feel that I am able to be more who I'd like to be than I maybe was earlier in my life.
Yeah, I mean, I think, Mike, the reality is, I think we go through stages, and what we can ask of ourselves at one point in our life may not be what we can ask at another point of life, right? At some points in our life, our relationships become really important to us. It really matters to us how we're raising our kids, right? But when our kids are 30 or 35 and they've got their own lives and that, all of a sudden we worry maybe a little less about them. Maybe we think more about the grandkids, or why don't we have grandkids? Or maybe we start thinking about elderly parents, or maybe we start thinking about larger social questions, or maybe we have to start coming to terms with our own diminishment. One of the things that kicks in for many of us at a certain point in our life is you really begin to experience in a very real way, I am limited. And I'm not just limited in terms of my intelligence or my time or my energy. I'm really limited in terms of, as a creature, this is going to end. And it's going to end at a time and a place not of my choosing. And I may come down with some injury or some illness that really hems me in and limits what I can do and what I'm capable of. But I'm still capable of asking, how will I respond to my diminishment? How will I respond to becoming weaker, more tired, less able, more forgetful? Am I going to rail against the gods for this? How could they do this to me? Or am I going to accept that part of the human condition is coming to terms with creatureliness, and that part of our lives is to really understand our limitations and not let that embitter us or anger us, but let that transform us so that we learn something about the human condition. And maybe we become a bit more patient and a bit more compassionate towards others who are struggling with their limitations. When I think, I am in control and I'm doing great, it's very easy for me to say, why don't they get their act together? Why don't they do better? I've done it. They can do it too, And you hear that sometimes, like even now in these debates about immigration, my parents came to this country. They didn't ask for welfare. They pulled themselves up by their bootstraps, Much of that is historical BS, by the way. But if you look at the history of welfare rolls in this country, but But even if it's true, there is this tendency when we're strong, we're not always terribly patient or compassionate towards the weak. But when we become weak, maybe we begin to understand a little bit more about what the crosses are that other people are carrying. But we only will do that if we don't become angry and embittered about our limitations and our weakness. But if we begin to really bring that into our identity and understand, this is a stage in the journey. Me coming to terms with, I am a vulnerable creature. And the one thing about a creature is I am not in control. So I can't save my parents from dying. I can't save my spouse from dying. I can't save myself from dying. And to come to terms with those kinds of realities, that's to come face to face, right, with being a creature before God. And then the question simply becomes, do I accept that God who confronts me in those moments that Bob was mentioning, is this a loving and gracious God? Or is this a God who is cruel and barbaric to me by making me experience this kind of limit in my life? And it's those kinds of choices about how do we confront our limitations that I think are often the really transformative stages in our lives.
Thank you, Father Ken. And we'll resume this again next week at 7 o'clock next Wednesday.
We deal with the happy topic of sin next week.
Yes, that's more sin.